Before I get started, I just want to say a couple of things to contextualize what I'm going to try to do right now, some of which will be in dialogue with some of the things that we heard yesterday. One of the advantages and pleasures of getting to go quite late on in a conference like this is clearly that you get to listen to everybody else's work, first of all, and then to adjust your thinking a little bit and reshape your directions and with the benefit of other people's work. So I wanted to start actually by just directly addressing the question about abstract labour that came up yesterday, and this will resound throughout the talk that I'm about to give, so please don't worry if you weren't there yesterday. This might seem a little narrowly technical, but the project that I'm about to describe and to give a bit of began for me when reading through Capital, this great book whose anniversary we're celebrating today. I found what seemed to be an absolutely extraordinary failure of translation, or a sudden glitch or mistranslation, which at first seemed to me as though it could perhaps just have been kind of a question of the judgment of the translator and perhaps a certain kind of smoothing of the argument for the sake of clarity, but which soon appeared to me to be something potentially quite a lot more substantial than that, with far greater consequences, actually, for how we might interpret not just something so nebulous as Marxist style, whatever we might call that, or however we might conceive it, but the very logic of categories itself within the critique of political economy. So that was this category, precisely the one that Elena was talking about in her paper yesterday, of abstract human labour. And my question yesterday about that was to do with the choice of that very predicate, abstract, which it seems to me is one which is very much overdetermined by Marx's critical engagement with philosophers in the tradition of Hegel. But the word which he uses to describe what abstract human labour is this word Gelehrte there at the top, and I know this essay of mine has been out for a while, so it will be familiar to perhaps a few people in the room. But Marx says abstract human labour is a mere Gelehrte of undifferentiated human labour. And it was this that first set off some alarm bells ringing in my head. So the word Gelehrte, when I looked up contemporary definitions of this noun, it's not an abstract process like Folks's choice of the word congelation, which is the one which is used in Folks's translation in the Penguin edition, and which has since then just circulated unproblematically and without being questioned in all of the Anglophone reception of Marx. In fact, since it was first put into English in 1886, and I'll come back to that in a second. But Gelehrte is the name not of an abstract process, but of a specific commodity. And Gelehrte is here in Meyer's Konversationslexikon, which Marx certainly read because he also contributed an article to it himself. Gelehrte is a kind of gelatin, as you can see there. It's a breakfast product. It's something that's used in jam, and it's used by creating, it's by rendering down hoofs and antlers. It's McDonald's, essentially. So abstract human labour is gelatin created by the rendering down into a tremulous, massy blob of the offcuts of animals, i.e. humans treated as animals, into this repulsive substance which has, besides its functions in culinary uses, also has functions in cosmetics and other things. Now, it struck me that something actually was going on at a profound level within the very conduct of the logic of categories here, rather than something simply at a superficial level, at the level of figuration or representation of that process of categories. And so I started thinking a bit more broadly about what might be possibly something like a poetics of the text of Das Kapital, and about a number of related problems. First of all, the problem of the translation of that poetics into English, which is part of what I'll discuss today, but also perhaps the more intractable and sort of deeper going problem, what it might mean for how we actually interpret and understand the logic of categories itself. What is Marx's critique if it's filled with moments like this all of the time? Are these to be conceptualized simply as the kind of figurative excesses of Marxist materialism, or are they that materialism itself? Is Marx's materialism one which has inseparably, and as one of its sort of intrinsic motivations and drives, a kind of disfigurative energy like this, which forces us into conflict with what seem like sort of horribly unacceptable images or accounts of what we're doing when we do something so simple as buy a commodity. We're cannibalizing each other. So it seems to me that some more could be done about the Poetics of Capital, and I'm going to just give a brief kind of overview of this project today. I'll say one more thing about it before I get started. So one text that was, for me, very influential and helpful in thinking how to set about doing this was a text called Translating Freud, Traduire Freud, not yet actually translated into English, by Jean Laplanche and others. And Laplanche, as people may know, was the sort of chief editor of the French edition of the works of Sigmund Freud. And he wrote this text explaining for his French readers the difficulties that he encountered when trying to translate Freud into French. And he described he described this process of what he called the discovery of latent concepts in Freud. And what he meant by latent concepts was the discovery of words which seemed irresistibly to present the possibility of a process of conceptualization which seemed, as they reappeared throughout the texts by Freud, that Laplanche and his co-editors read as they worked on the translation, they seemed to accumulate a kind of indefinite conceptual potential without ever being fully and definitively given as concepts by Freud. So it may be that Freud himself might not have been altogether yet quite conscious of the conceptual potential of some of these words, which nonetheless he repeated at crucial parts of his argument. Now, it seems to me that there are all sorts of latent, so far, unmobilized potential concepts in Das Kapital too, many of them with a specifically poetic potential. So I'm going to talk just about a couple of those today, but there's tons of them, and I've written about some of the others in other contexts. So this, if you're interested in this, is in that essay Marx and Jargon. If you're interested, I've written an essay about the poetics of relative surplus value, believe it or not, in an essay called Blocks, which you can find online, which is about some poets in this room and others. Today I'm going to talk about a couple of these concepts and about the idea of this project in general. What might it mean to read Capital looking for so far immobilized and latent concepts? And does this, furthermore, require that we actually seek out not just the logic of categories, which is immediately available at the surface of the conduct of Marx's argument, but some other kind of logic, tangled up with the logic of categories? Is there some other kind of logic which destabilizes the logic of categories, motivates it, and complicates it, and perhaps drives that argument into what Titi in her brilliant paper yesterday called silences in the text of Capital, but which I'm going to try to conceive slightly differently from silence. Okay. So I'm just going to call this for a Marxist poetics, but really it's about the poetics that's in Capital. A year before the first English edition of Capital was published under his supervision in 1886, Engels issued a brief polemic against the daring and pretensions of anyone who would be reckless enough to think that this great work by Marx could be translated into English by a mere bourgeois man of letters. Engels, this is the text I'll read out in just a second. The specific target of Engels' polemic was the unfortunate figure Henry Mayers Hindman. I don't know if anyone here knows about Hindman. He was a would-be communist, but went to Eton and was always showing up unannounced at the Marx's household and interrupting their Shakespeare nights until finally the Marxes banned him from coming round. Anyway, so the target of Engels' polemic is Hindman, identified in Engels' essay by his pseudonym, which he used in his publications, which was John Broadhouse. After reading the French translation of Capital in 1880, Broadhouse had published in 1881, immediately afterwards, his own book called England for All, 2 chapters of which were so thoroughly plagiarized from Capital that they in effect represented the first English translations of it, abridgments of it. Marx was absolutely outraged by this, incidentally, even though Hindman identifies him, but anonymously at the front says, "I've borrowed from the work of a great thinker." Marx is like, yeah, who? Anyway, he was outraged. So Broadhouse had tried to translate Marx. Engels' response, this essay, was called How Not to Translate Marx, and it's brutal and unsparing in its assessment of Hindman's bungled, conservative, devitalizing, and mushily approximate prose. So, Engels says, Marx is one of the most vigorous and concise writers of the age. To render him adequately, a man must be a master not only of German, but of English too. Mr. Broadhouse, however, though evidently a man of respectable journalistic accomplishments, commands but that limited range of English used by and for conventional literary respectability. Here he moves with ease, but this sort of English is not a language into which Das Kapital can ever be translated. Powerful German requires powerful English to render it. The best resources of the language have to be drawn upon. New coined German terms require the coining of corresponding new terms in English. It's a really important point that I'll come back to. Marx was almost like Shakespeare, a perpetual inventor of neologisms throughout his writings, but you would never guess that from the folks. But as soon as Mr. Broadhouse is faced by such a difficulty, not only his resources fail him, but also his courage. The slightest extension of his limited stock in trade, the slightest innovation upon the conventional English of everyday literature frightens him, and rather than risk such a heresy, he renders the difficult German word by a more or less indefinite term, which does not grate upon his ear, but obscures the meaning of the author, or, worse still, he translates it, as it recurs, by a whole series of different terms, forgetting that a technical term has to be rendered always by one and the same equivalent. That's Engels. So the powerful language of Das Kapital, then, could only grate upon such a delicate device as Broadhouse's ear, and I think in diagnostician's mode, I propose this as a new kind of pathology or syndrome, Broadhouse's ear syndrome. And Broadhouse's ear, whose sensitivity to verbal dissonance and other kinds of loud noise justifies recourse to a more mellifluous, essentially a more commodious journalistic type of idiom of argument, where, quote, more or less indefinite equivalents of Marx's words sound better than literal, definite equivalents of Marx's words. So it can be for the sake of harmony, then, that in his book, England for All, Broadhouse writes that, quote, and he's just pilfering Marx here, capital, says Broadhouse, is the produce of past labour devoted to present production. Capital is, in fact, the saving of past labour for the special purpose of increasing the future store. Now, it might sound like that's just what Marx says. But what do these very words do for the Broadhouse's ear? What world do they signify? How respectful are they of the auditory canals that are the destination of their concepts? So let's think about these very words. The process of the devotion of what is saved, as Broadhouse describes it, notably sounds less perforating to the Christian eardrum than Marx's emphatic, brutal, disfigurative description of the pumping out and sucking empty of what is dead, rather the devotion of what is saved than the sucking off of what is dead. Capital, says Marx, is literally an Auspumper, literally a pumper out, that performs the Aussaugung, literally the sucking out of the worker. The sucking empty, less than the saving of what was devoted than a kind of hideous dredging into vacuousness. Broadhouse might reasonably object that, after all, the point is the same, the logic is the same, that what matters is not the particular words or syntax selected to represent these categories, but only that the logic of categories be properly understood. After all, he, Broadhouse too, wants his readers to fight capitalism. This is Broadhouse. You then, Broadhouse goes on, now addressing the workers directly, you who produce the wealth in every country, consider where you stand. You men who have seen your homes broken up, your health destroyed, and have beheld your wives and children fade away under the tyranny of capitalism, stop and think, end quote. That's Broadhouse. So this is then a direct paraphrase and abbreviation of what I think is the single most furious passage and the most comprehensively discussed in all of Capital 1. If you've got the Penguin, it's page 799, where there is a great bombardment of a paragraph where Marx says that the wives and children of male workers are, quote, dragged under the wheels of the juggernaut. Marx fires up the image of the beloved limbs of family members ripped up and their beloved heads crushed flat. Broadhouse softens the mental lighting so that these same beloved limbs and bodies instead, rather more agreeably, just fade away, in his language, ephemeral as an enchantment in a forest by John Keats. I think it's literally a quotation from the Ode to a Nightingale, fade away into the forest dim. And then stop and think, says Broadhouse, and take heed. The workers who in Marx are crushed, sucked out, laid waste, desertified, elasticated, tortured, and distorted into human specks, stumps, and fractions, and those are all literal translations of what Marx says, are by Broadhouse regenerated in the language of literary respectability as fainting lyric poets, rejoicing in gleams and being cast into despair, etc. Literally, he says, the workers are those, quote, who now rejoice in the gleam of a transient prosperity, only to be cast into deeper despair on the next stagnation. That's Broadhouse. So, Engels, this sort of English is not a language into which Das Kapital can ever be translated, says Engels. Not the particular sequence of images only, or the general climate of representation merely, not only what we might call its aesthetics or its figurative language, but the critique itself, the logic of categories and all, cannot be made to exist without what Engels calls the courage to innovate upon the conventional English of the everyday literature. And of course, that's relative to whatever our everyday literature happens to be. For us today, it happens to be our everyday literature that has to be fucked up. As for readers afflicted with a case of Broadhouse's ear, the point is precisely that these people, should actually be hurt by the critique. Broadhouse wants it not to grate. For Marx, it has to grate. It has to hurt. The comfort of the reader with the Broadhouse's ear is the obscuring of the meaning of capital. It's the physiological obscuration of the text. I'm at ease reading it. It is the subjectivation of the logic of categories as anesthetized logical thinking. Not only Marx's verbal skill, but the work of the critique itself is effectually obscured by the easy breathing of these readers, the safety of their ears from violence, and their every painless step through the mere logic of categories. The language in which Broadhouse, in Engels' phrase, moves with ease, is in effect the anti-poetic securitization of this complacency, and a barrier against the truth of capital, which is painful. Cured of its specific poetry, the truth of capital is dissipated in anesthetized logical thinking. Engels could not really mean this if he did not think that capital has a poetics, or if he thought that the poetics of capital could safely be treated as nothing but the excesses of Marx's materialism, just a kind of getting carried away with figurative language. The truth that Engels spells out in this polemic is that the poetics of capital goes far deeper than whatever images, figurations, or verbal decorations of thought anyone who is content with the limited range of English used by and for conventional literary respectability might agree to call poetic. It's not that kind of poetry. Capital is poetic throughout and fundamentally. Its truth is not only logical and historical truth, but at the same time and inexorably also always poetic truth. And critique, in Marx's sense, is not like so-called political economy, which Marx detested from top to bottom and said abolished truth and turned black to white and white to black. It is not like the logic of that, an essentially unruffled process of exposition only superficially studied with images and illustrations that do nothing but help make sense of the work done with logical categories. Critique, in Marx's sense, is the opposite of Broadhouse's moving with ease. It is an obstructed movement. It's a not being able to move, by which I mean both an unsettling and setting in turbulent and agitated motion, not merely of fixed or stalled or paralyzed ideas, but of the whole experience of thinking, and ultimately of the whole experience of being alive, a running up against and slamming into impassable contradictions, a getting stuck in hateful corners of cognitively intractable paradox, and also a kind of moving by being obstructed, a moving on the spot, a working out of life in thought and logic where the movement of the concept is identical to the paralysis of the concept. For the simple and also the infinitely incomprehensible reason that the world just hasn't changed yet. It's the same world. And we are still stuck in the capital relation where thinking by itself is intrinsic to paralysis. I just want to say that here I might dispute one of the things that were said on the previous panel about how it's essential that we find a way out, that subjectivation is finding the exit, first of all from Hegel, then from capital, as though Hegel, finding a way out from Hegel was the way out from capital. It seems to me we should instead figure out just how much we are stuck. There is not a way out purely through subjectivation or by escaping Hegel or Hegelian categories. There simply isn't. That seems to me a pathology of the 68 moment of thought, that all of those thinkers are desperate to get out of Hegel in all sorts of different ways, as though that was getting out of capital or pointing a way out at least. I think instead we should figure out just how stuck we are. Capital itself, according to Marx, quote, can only be grasped as a movement, and the poetics of capital is the obstructed movement of thought that cannot, by magic or fiat, simply be realized or subjectivated into life, but must exert all its pressure and every power of conception to grasp the catastrophically obstructed movement of life and the obstructed movement of capital. So Engels said then that political economy is science conceived and developed by men, quote, who could not afford to see the truth. Truth, in Capital's critique of political economy, comes at another cost. We have to be able to afford to see it. And it's a cost that is more than financial and more than a crisis of ethical conscience. The truth of Capital makes life harder to live. It fucks you up. Reading the critique and grasping its truth and its necessity means being turned against the world. Life becomes harder all the time. It's a critique of reality that confirms in logic the feeling that we all have that reality is somehow fundamentally inimical to life. And that gives us the massively pressurized substance to that feeling, not just by articulating it in a logic of categories, but by tangling up the logic of categories with another logic, harder to read, but nonetheless unmistakably manifest to anyone who was ever really hurt by reading this book. The logic of categories is everywhere tangled up with what I want to call the logic of passion. This is not just figuration, it's another logic, a counter logic that's at work. I borrow this phrase, logic of passion, from the French psychoanalyst André Green, who briefly describes it as, quote, the logic of oneness, duality, trinity, conjunctions, disjunctions, fusions, and separations. He says this is an archaic logic, but it's different from the primary process. It's not just the unconscious, because it can be mobilized. We can take hold of it, and it can be a question of artifice. We can direct its activities. So it's a logic of something like the primary process, but a logic of what happens in the primary process that can be mobilized and put to use, a logic of passion. The manifest proximity of this logic, with its oneness, duality, etc., and its, in truth, only semi-categorical categories to the logic of Hegel and the concept is not just coincidental, but it's a kind of constitutive blurring and wavering between the one and the other, what I want to call being tangled up. The two logics are tangled up, the logic of categories and the logic of passion. Oneness in Capital is not the same as Hegel's unity. It's a kind of madness for intimacy, beyond and against the only form of the relation that Marx says is possible for workers in the capital relation, which is, circulating as commodities. But neither is this purely a question of desire, simply, or of some other capacity of the subject that is disposable from the logic of the critique. Rather, it is the tangling up of these forms of the concept, each one never fully resolvable without loss into the logic of the other, that generates the extreme passion of this critique, which is also its poetics. Trying to grasp everything that capital means for being alive is itself already a resistance to being crushed. Cognitive, imaginative, poetic, fantastical, desiring, anxious, conceptual resistance. It means being subject to new kinds of pain, new kinds of loud noise. It means figuring out how to take pain for truth and pain for knowledge. The structure of domination that the logic of categories makes explicit really does hurt. Making explicit, in this case, doesn't just mean making comprehensible, but it means making actually more intolerable, actually more unbearable, more absolute. Marx says that we are the Träger, the bearers of value. We have to make the value that we bear unbearable through the passion of the critique. Things don't get easier once they are explained. They get suffocating, they get crushing. Adorno wrote, "There is a condition of all truth to make suffering eloquent." And Capital has been deeply conditioned by this same essentially poetic imperative to make suffering eloquent. That is its logic too. The logical explication that makes life unbearable for the bearers of value is essential to the work that Capital still has to do now, its living task, as Gayatri Spivak said yesterday, in the world that we will all die in. Readers of Marx who want actually to live the life before they die that Marx dreamed might be possible, who want a world free of a world, quote, of free individuality based on the universal development of individuals, which is how Marx defined communism, instead of compulsory stultification, a world of phobias and hatreds, mass poverty, and the systematic conversion of productivity into torture. People who really want that cannot avoid or hedge about with dusty abstractions and supererogatory theoretical refinements of the salaried thinker the pure horror of the reality that Marx's critique drills into your head as pressure. The condition of hearing this truth is, first of all, this command, everywhere intrinsic to Marx's thought: do not obscure the violence and horror of this reality by ameliorating it. Make it as hard as it really is. The truth of capital hurts, so the truth of reading Das Kapital has to hurt too. This is profoundly a question about poetics. Marx famously wrote that capital seizes the individual via the very roots of life. The book, Capital's Critique, tries to do something like the same thing, to seize hold of life right down to the same roots. It finds and specifies the true, material, logical, social, sensible limits where the impossibility of free individuality based on the universal development of individuals must actually be repulsed and felt and endured, so that the possibility of life can actually be radically enlarged. We have to feel those limits as hard as they are. The poetics of the critique of capital has to be active at every step of that seizure, all the way down, to go as deep, reach as far, stretch to everything, detect in every paralysis of life, every paralysis of the subject and its potential explosion, tune into every signal of the catastrophe, and find a way to make the logic of categories itself resound with the pain of devastated life laid waste in a wilderness of infinite violence. This reaching into everything and finding everywhere the carnage of crushed life and binding logic up with madness and paradox to pinpoint the potential for eruption out of the world as capital has made it is the poetics of capital. It's resounding with paralyzed thought, speck life, obstructive life, and the future necessity of their explosion. Resounding. It is now entirely possible, wrote Marx in the Grundrisse, a famous sentence, it is now entirely possible that consonance may be reached only by passing through the most extreme dissonance, the worst sound in the world. Every new aspect of a science involves a revolution in the technical terms of that science, Engels wrote in the preface to the English edition of Capital in 1886. Marx had performed this revolution in technical vocabulary, and the tendency of Broadhouse's softening of painful and dissonant critical thought into, quote, the conventional English of everyday literature was essentially counter-revolutionary, trading euphemisms in hell. But worse even than this hideous amelioration of individual words, according to Engels, was the freedom of expression with which it has been exercised. The freedom of expression all but amounts to a counter-revolutionary methodology, an anti-poetics. Faced with a compound noun or a grating neologism in Das Kapital, whose latent or premonitory conceptual power needs ingeniously specifying and amplifying in English, Broadhouse instead, to come back to Engels, quote, translates it as it recurs by a whole series of different terms, forgetting that a technical term has to be rendered always by one and the same equivalent. For Engels, the failure to do this was outright treachery, a cover-up of the critique and the neutralization of its poetic power to specify the definite unbearableness of life, that the logic of categories exists, after all, only in order to magnify. And yet, the only translations that we have of Capital in English, including the Moore and Aveling and the Folks translations, are not faithful to this principle, which Engels says is paramount. So, just to finish off, a brief explanation of how they are not. Lots of latent or potential concepts in Das Kapital are at best only flickeringly detectable in the English text. Where Marx repeated the same word, often a neologism that he invented specifically, an ugly neologism that he made up to capture the twisted truth of an idea or a fucked up fact that ordinary speech had simply not tried to deal with, and that the language of conventional literary respectability had bent over backwards to obscure and to trivialize, so that through the repetition of this word, it would begin to acquire what would look or feel like or promise a definite conceptual profile, conceptual latency, his English translators have tended, on the whole, for the purposes of clarification, to paraphrase these words in a variety of ways at different points of their versions, in effect, not only occluding the latent potential or already definite conceptual power of the individual word, but at the same time annulling its specific power to hurt, unpicking and softening the binding of the logic whose strangulation of life it was intended to help to articulate. So, one brief example, Marx's neologism, Wertgegenständigkeit, a horrible mouthful, deliberately, especially if you've had lots of coffee like I have, literally, Wertgegenständigkeit, value objectivity, would be its literal translation, is paraphrased by Folks in the Standard Penguin edition. These are just some of its appearances. First of all, as the objectivity of commodities as values, then as objective character as values, then as objectivity as a value, then as objectivity of the products of labor as values. Those are all paraphrases of that single word, Wertgegenständigkeit. Now, the paraphrases clearly mean roughly the same thing, but they are not evidently the repetition of a single concept or the tightening of a single bind. They are not the hammering home or the droning in the ear of that very neologism in all its despicable grossness as both a technical term and the parody of a technical term at once. Neither are these paraphrases overtly tangled up in lateral lexical rigging of the kind that Marx tossed over the heads of his German readers to catch them in inexorable nets of association, when, for example, in the space of a single page on the chapter on the commodity in chapter 1, Marx floods the logic of categories with a torrent of overtly genetically related neologisms to make the already grated Broadhouse ear ring until it spins. So, just after Wertgegenständigkeit, we have Wertding, Wertspiegel, Wertkörper, Wertausdruck, Wertform, Wertgröße, tumbling after it in its wake. That's all on one page. Those are literally translated value thing, value expression. They're not. They're literally translated object of value by Folks, a mirror for the value, object of value. They're all paraphrased rather than the individual words with Wert at the front, which Marx says. Now, the power in the German Das Kapital of these grotesque words caught in the obstructed act of being incompletely or parodically conceptualized, their power to proliferate new lexical fields in a pastiche of logical complexity, is part of the essential movement of the Poetics of Capital. It pastiches logical complexity even as it is, in fact, also actually logically complex. The mad dilation of the concept as such, not only, as if by a kind of viral eruption through language, articulates a spontaneous, semi-parodic logic of categories, so that the value expression of the value thing is suddenly read in its reflection in the value mirror, but the same dilation is meant to be, for us, asphyxiating, hateful, crazy, like being drowned in balloon animals while trying to knit your way out of a blizzard. This, too, is the truth of value objectivity. That's what it means, how hateful this is. Being stuck in that lexical field, not just its style of presentation or its rhetoric. Wertgegenständigkeit is the inexorable logical regime of, and this is my interpretation of that word, objectivity without object relations, or in other words, the individual that you are, gaping at itself in the value mirror and shouting its angry value expressions in the contorted postures of an abstract value expressionist. To exist in the capital relation is to exist value objectively as a value thing with a value body represented in value expressions gaping into the value mirror, or not at all. So, finally, if we take seriously not only Engels' apparently deadly serious demand that technical terms in capital must be rendered by one and the same equivalent, and his conviction that not only powerful English, as he puts it, the best resources of the language and new coined terms in English will do, but also the unavoidable implication of this, that capital is both critique and poetics at once, always both, and that the power of the poetics is the power of the critique, deadlocked in the tangle of inseparable but irresolvable logics, the logic of categories, the logic of passion, then it surely becomes absolutely imperative right now to the future effect and destiny of this great work, its task in our lives, to get the poetics right. And that has to mean to make its whole logical power resound, passion and logic at once, both the logic of categories and the logic of passion, to get its energies of conception and disfiguration ramped up to the furthest extreme of dissonance, to make its explication of the unbearableness of being a bearer of value and the infinite indignity of life under capital actually feel acutely unbearable right now, at every moment, whatever it takes, and in whatever language not only gets the categories to make sense, but also pressurizes the experience of making sense of them, since they shouldn't exist even to be made sense of in the first place. Enough that their social, psychic, and individual truth can at last erupt out of their bare content of brutal logical consistency.